Please note that we are recording this session. You can keep your camera on, but it will be recorded. So this event is part of an open access interdisciplinary seminar series that aims to engage all of you with some of the biggest topics in the field. This series invites seminal professional speakers to discuss subjects such as climate science, justice, sustainable agriculture, and much more. So stay tuned for more interesting seminars coming up. The seminar series is linked to the KITS Sustainability and Climate module, a fully co-created, open access and interdisciplinary module covering the biggest topic in sustainability, from climate change and food to sustainable finance and social justice. If you haven't enrolled yet, for all of King's students and staff, we will encourage you to check it out. We will share the link in the chat. So now let's dive into the seminar. First, Jasmine Isla Qureshi is a journalist, writer, and marine queer biologist and ecologist working as a researcher and previously for the BBC Natural History Unit, the Mindfulness Initiative on Climate Youth Resilience, currently working with the grassroots organization Wildcard on increasing engagement and support for rewilding campaigns in the UK. Then we will hear from Elena Grice, an activist and rewilder working with Wildcard and Curlew Action as a campaigner, project managers, and communities lead. Her work crosses the biodiversity crisis and land justice, looking at how land has concentrated into the hands of fewer people, while at the same time seeing catastrophic declines in biodiversity. And finally, at the end of the seminar, we will hear from Dr. Nicola Hogan, Sustainability Manager at King College, who will share some action taken by King's to restore biodiversity on campuses. I will now hand over to Jasmine, sharing the slides. There you go.
Hello, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, of course, put it in the group chat, and then we can figure it out. Or, you know, you can just not listen to me, which you'll find is one of the points I'm making. So I'm here to talk about decolonizing conservation, which is, again, an extremely large topic. It's a topic that I can't possibly hope to cover all of in this session. And I feel like even in a session that's many hours long, we wouldn't be covering all of it to absolution. So even if you come away from this presentation with a few words, remembering, questioning, maybe even just thinking about some of the concepts that you deal with in everyday life a bit differently, that's kind of the aim. There is no need to come away having learned everything. So I hope everyone has a laid back experience during this. So we've already done this bit. I hadn't actually realized we would be introduced, so I already did this little slide at the beginning. And the reason I do this little slide at the beginning is because I think within the topic of ecology, especially decolonizing ecology, one of the processes of decolonization is to decolonize and deconstruct the hierarchy of education, the ways that these topics are taught, especially ecology-wise, and some of the kind of more sciencey or quote unquote higher education kind of topics. They're always taught to people in a very specific way, and the person who is centered and who leads and is hierarchical within the space is the teacher, and the science or subject can also be told or taught as a very faceless subject without emotional bias or connection. So this slide is just kind of getting to know who I am and building more of a personal connection with me and the subject. So I do all of these different various roles, but also my identity as a trans, Desi, non-binary Muslim woman, and someone who works within these different fields connects me to it in a very specific, very different way than other people who may be learning about the topic. And that's mainly to highlight that if you're talking about this topic and if you are decolonizing a topic, it's not just about learning. It's also about doing. It's a daily practice. Decolonization in particular is a daily practice, and it is something that if you practice in real life, when you're doing tasks or when you're talking about a topic, and when you're especially connecting yourself to the topic, it works better in the long run. So that's what this slide is basically for. It's also to highlight that alongside some of the more kind of stereotypical things that I do in terms of my roles in conservation and writing, I'm also a poet and also a writer of creative writing, and that means that I tend to center creativity and authenticity in a lot of the subjects I'm talking about, specifically with nature. Again, I think it's a really key it's a key concept in decolonization, to deconstruct this idea that we're dealing with science versus something else. And actually what we're dealing with is interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary subjects and multiple ways and perspectives of approaching the subject. So this is the definition of decolonization or decolonial practice. It's something that if you look it up, you'll get this this particular definition or variations of this definition. But I've highlighted two words here because I think they're probably the most important from my point of view and from the point of view of this talk in terms of talking about decolonization, because colonization deals with occupation and exploitation. Now, of course, it leaks into policy, it leaks into practices, it leaks into even just subtly going about our daily lives. And I'm going to expand more on that in this slide. So colonialism. What is colonialism? It's a very big word. It's seemingly thrown about a lot of the time. And I think it's used in conservation and nature sometimes in the wrong way, or ways in which it cannot be deconstructed, I think, in a euphoric or community-led way. So colonialism, as we've just talked about, deals with occupation and exploitation. Now, this can be of minds, it can be of bodies, it can be of land, education, personal relationships, public relationships, emotional relationships. And actually, when we're talking about the colonization or colonial practice of landscapes and of nature, it can't just happen in a linear way. It has to happen through the colonization of people as well, of societies. And that will lead us later on in this to how to deconstruct it, because we have to also be centering human relationships, but also talking about social relationships. We have to be talking about nature and community living alongside each other. So capitalism, to me, is quite a large word within colonialism. Capitalism deals, in my perspective, with the moving of capital from one area to the other via a person or community or collective that is powerful enough to move that capital or that product from one area to the other, and therefore it excludes that product from one area or community or organization. So if we're dealing with capitalism, we're dealing with the movement of things. We're dealing with the movement of things that have value. And again, this often relies upon one power being more powerful than the other, and therefore having the power to move that product from one area to the other. When we're talking about capitalism, we do have to talk about efficiency, because if we're talking about the movement of one thing from one area to the other, we're talking about something that has been done historically. When we look at how capitalism has manifested itself throughout history and throughout many practical elements of society, we're talking about something that's done in efficient ways. And when I talk about efficiency, I'm talking about the movement of the most things in the shortest amount of time. When I'm talking about science and how science and nature has been infected by capitalism, then I'm actually talking about a lot of scientific method, because scientific method is often done via assumption. And when I'm talking about facts, I will also reference this, because if we're talking about assumption, we're talking about quick change decisions. We're talking about things that are told to us as absolutes. So often if we have sets of facts, these are things that are suggested to be absolute or foundational to a subject or structure. And if they are poked again and again in a particular setting or by a particular set of people, that is told to us as being the proof of said fact. And facts are actually assumptions that then, of course, as I've just talked about, are poked again and again in a particular setting by a particular set of people. And that's what makes them fact in many ways. That is done through a method of efficiency a lot of the time. And that tends to be the skeleton of capitalism. Now, colonialism, if we're talking about, again, occupation and exploitation, whether that be of people, landscapes, structures, education, whatever it might be, that is done in a very quote unquote efficient way. And it relies a lot of the time on capitalism and the structures of capitalism within policy, within practice, to make it be efficient and therefore to make it be productive to the people who are carrying out colonialism. So I think it's good to be aware of the foundations of colonialism and what it is. The other words on here do also link to colonialism and the ways that it is practiced, especially in the societies that we are existing in right now. So, for example, pseudo-freedom. This is a set of words that often relate to privilege and how people can access certain structures or certain services within a system, because that's what privilege is to me, I think. It's not something that is inherently negative or positive. It can be connected to negative and positive things, but privilege deals with the access of a certain community or person to services within a system. Therefore, it changes across systems, and therefore it can be different for individuals based on interactions. But this is linked to pseudo-freedom because pseudo-freedom is something that references the ability of someone to feel liberated within a system and therefore to feel as if they are not being pushed in a particular direction or colonized in a particular way. Because colonization is quite a big word. And when a lot of people hear it, they do tend to recoil. They do tend to feel as if it's not happening to me. It's not happening to our system. This happened a long, long time ago. And the reliance of the structure of colonialism and capitalism on this idea of pseudo-freedom means that if you have access to a particular set of services within a system, and therefore it is curated more towards you, you tend to not feel as if that system is colonized because you are liberated within that system to a certain extent. And therefore, you don't tend to relate or understand the experiences of people who aren't curated to that particular system and therefore who do not feel liberated. And that breaks people up. That allows for a more disunified view of liberation, and therefore it actually works against the idea of decolonization. Again, something I think useful to be aware of. If we're talking about decolonization, we have to be aware what colonization is, colonialism is, and also the ways in which we are limited in terms of deconstructing it or fighting against it. This idea of nature versus people, again, relates to this. Nature versus people is something that I've come across in one of my avenues of study, if you like, called queer ecology. If I'm looking at queer theory, then I often reference Indigenous rebellion. Indigenous rebellion is, so what I'm referencing basically is one of the initial binaries or dualisms that was imposed upon Indigenous communities by colonial settlers or colonialists moving into landscapes and suggesting that Indigenous peoples who had beforehand lived more intertwined with natural history and with nature and with the ecosystems around them, it was imposed upon them that actually nature is a different entity to humans, and therefore it is easier to make nature into a resource. And that imposition of that dualism or that binary on Indigenous communities is seen as one of the initial dualisms that sparks a lot of the binaries and a lot of the structures of identity that we have now, which again is connected. So when we're talking about colonialism, it's important to also talk about the limitation of people's identity, the limitation of community practice, and the limitation of Indigenous tribal practices and understandings of nature. Because again, this is where colonialism came from, and this spawns a lot of the structures that limit us in deconstructing it today. So let's go to the next slide. So this is kind of why we're here. because I can talk about colonialism in a very vague sense. I can talk about colonialism maybe in a more specific sense, but colonial conservation is an interesting one. People don't often talk about how nature is connected a lot of the time within Western hemispheric societies or Western modern science. Colonialism is not often connected to conservation because nature, again, has been taught and shown to us as a very systematic, very linear subject, and therefore it has no emotional ties or emotional bias allowed within it. And this idea of impartiality in science also comes from that, because an elitist, again, elitist over here is what I'm referring to is groups of people who have the most privilege within said system, therefore have the most access, and usually at the beginning of said systems are the people who constructed those systems. And so that's who I'm referring to when I'm talking about elitist or elitism within communities and within structures. So elitist beginnings of science are what constructs this idea that you must be impartial to be within science and within nature and conservation, because you tend not to connect emotional bias to those subjects and you tend not to reflect, which again links back to this original dualism and binary of nature versus people, where you split apart the reflection and connection of people and humans to other animals and to the wider environment, so that they are easier to predict and they are easier to control in terms of taking resources from the environment, which again is a very prominent core to colonialism and how it happens around the globe. So when we're talking about colonial conservation, if we keep in mind how colonization occurs and what colonialism is, then we can also talk about this in terms of nature restoration and conservation practice. Again, conservation practice, in this sense, I'm just talking about the protection or the nurturing of natural environments by perhaps people, by communities, by organizations. Conservation comes under many different banners and is used by many different peoples and organizations. Now, the issue with conservation, of course, when it is redefined, is that like nature and natural history and science, it is redefined by particular persons and people. And if we again look to how societies and systems of education are used and built, the voices that are most heard, that are the loudest within a system, are the ones who are the most privileged, have the most access to the services and platforms within that system that allows them to be heard. Thus, if we're talking about conservation practice, we are often referencing practices which have developed, especially within some of the more modern societies that we see now. These are systems of conservation that have developed as per elitist foundations and structures. And when I'm talking about settler colonialism and the settlers' audacity to stay and adapt to the land, I'm talking about every landscape and every country or continent or any particular education practice or system that, again, has been occupied by a particular powerful organization or group of people. And again, we reference capitalism and the movement of product. A powerful or larger or more dominant organization will move into a particular area, again, whether that be through theory, whether that be through education, whether that be through teaching, whether that be through physical, actually moving into the landscape, and then will attempt to adapt the land to better be curated to the persons who have moved in. And therefore, we see conservation being one of the branches of this. But conservation is told to us as being, again, this very neutral, this very safe way of protecting the environment. And I often have an issue with protection of the environment and direction of the environment by particular persons and people. Because when you read up about this, you do tend to see that the words that are used, the labels that are used, and also the systems that are used to construct these conservation practices come from a line of saviorism. They are often ways to save said environment. and they are often ways to make said environment better or more perfect. They are more subtle now, and there are more people breaking those down. So we don't see as often that they are so directly said as systems of saviorism or perfection. But the origins of them are the same. And I have some examples over here. So when I'm saying Raj and the predator problem, what I'm talking about is the British Raj in India and in many Desi diasporic. So I am Desi and diasporic, but my region of ancestry will be particular areas in South Asia. And the British Raj in India was a particular example of a colonial force that entered said region and then enforced or imposed certain constructs and ways of doing things on the indigenous populations and people who existed there already. One of these included conservation, and actually the decimation of large predators in those areas and the construction of particular pens or particular areas where animals should and shouldn't be, and the construction of societies and economic infrastructure that then was interlinked with forcing animals into particular regions was taught to the population under the guise of conservation practice a lot of the time. And that seems like quite a big thing, I think. When people hear about that, they're like, oh, yes, that's quite a big thing. That wouldn't happen today. But we do see that still happening. So in a lot of African nations and a lot of regions in Africa, again, I would love to talk about these in more detail, but I think I'm probably already going to go over time a bit. When I'm talking about particular regions in Africa and we're talking about conservation, we often have to talk about trophy hunting. And we do also have to talk about the practices of large NGOs, large white-centered and Eurocentric-led organizations who tend to move into those environments, who tend to carry out conservation practices without talking to indigenous or native populations of people, and therefore carry these out under the guise of perfecting or saving a landscape. But we do see in the long run that this tends to limit the landscape. This tends to destroy the landscape. Again, another example that we've seen, which might be closer to home, and a lot smaller example, but something that might be easier to reflect on, is badgers and farming. We see in landscapes in the UK, a lot of farming practices, perhaps in recent years, have been seen as central to processing the land in particular ways, which means that certain destruction occurs in those environments to foundational species, and progress is seen as producing more food or more product in those particular areas, and perhaps a thrival or nurturing of farm animals or particular animals that are used for product. This can have a detrimental effect on native wildlife, and one example has been the enlarging of farming environment or area, which has pushed into particular native species environments, for example, badgers. This has meant that badger species have moved into those environments, and there has been some passing of bovine TB to the cows. Again, bovine TB. Bovine is in reference to cows. And this has caused anger amongst farmers, who then start to limit the populations of badgers, as being told by the government that it is a necessary conservation practice, and that this necessary conservation practice will protect the wider environment and will also protect the farmer's product. This is now being unpicked and deconstructed more by other organizations and scientists and people, but actually a lot of policy that it was based on was said to be absolute, was said to be based in fact, and was said to be a very official and correct conservation practice to save and nurture British landscapes. So it still occurs. These are practices that are intertwined within policy, and they still happen today. and they happen in very large areas of the world, and they happen in very detrimental ways, and they also happen closer to home with similar detrimental impacts. So they still occur. But I think the main core of this is that colonization and colonialism has branches, and one of those branches can be conservation practice. Now, I've got a point here which says empty landscapes and the forced invisibility of indigeneity. Now, a big part of colonialism, as we've just spoken about, is the construction of a hierarchy where you feel that as the most, again, the loudest, most powerful voice within a particular space, you have the right and audacity to construct a perfect landscape, a perfect way of doing things, curated to yourself. And this develops into a practice because of saviorism and the idea that you are creating a better way of doing things. Now, one of the main ways that this is pushed is by the forced invisibility of indigenous tribes and native peoples, and the suggestion that landscapes are empty beforehand, or have been empty beforehand, of life, of nurtured, again, conservation practice, of people, and of better ways of doing things. This makes it easier to occupy and exploit a landscape, and it makes it a lot easier for conservation practice to take hold. Again, if we're looking at conservation hunting or trophy hunting, as opposed to, or in reference to whatever you're talking about in those landscapes, when you're talking about conservation practices in India and Pakistan, when you're talking about them abroad in other areas, when you're talking about them closer to home, it's easier to enforce conservation practice when you are told that said landscape is dead or has no usage beforehand, or has less usage beforehand, especially to the settlers or colonialists who have arrived in that area. So I think it's useful to know about that. Bugs and pesticides is another example. We see a lot of the time, so we're seeing a very large downfall in insect populations, particularly in the UK. Again, another closer to home example. This has come about through lots and lots of pressure from particular organizations to process landscapes, to process environments in particular ways, and to, again, enforce this split between humans and nature, which has caused a detriment of natural environments that could thrive very well within human and other social settings, but have not been allowed to because, again, of this enforced fact and this enforced conservation practice. So it happens everywhere, is what I'm trying to say. And it happens in these particular ways, and there might be other ways that you read and see, but it has this core of colonial and enforced saviorism. So how do we decolonize this? This can be a very, very long process, but it can happen straight away in terms of small steps. So I'll explain better. When you are decolonizing a system, I would actually say that that's not possible if it is a colonial system. A system that is built with the foundations being colonial hierarchy, imposed or forced ideas or foundations of something existing in a certain way, and a very much elitist and linear hierarchy. These are not things that need to be or should be changed or adapted to be curated better to other people, because what they are doing is using systems and tools within this particular system, which makes them unsustainable to the liberation of peoples and nature and communities within that system. So I would actually say that you cannot decolonize a colonial system. However, you can deconstruct and divest from that system, whilst at the same time investing and building alternative systems and ways of doing things, of existing, and of conserving nature. Now, these conservation practices don't have to come from the blue. They don't have to be built from scratch. There are blueprints that we can look at, and I'll reference a bit of these later. But these blueprints that exist, they exist in Indigenous thought and Indigenous understanding, and the wisdoms that still do exist in many communities and are understood in many communities, but again, have been forced out of the picture and have been erased by colonial structures and imperialist structures and imperialist governments that we see today. So again, divesting, an extremely important part of decolonization. Divesting means moving away from that system of doing things. But in order to do that, you need to understand what that system is. And that's what my previous slides were about. It's about awareness. It's about understanding where that pain is, where that struggle is within those systems. It's about looking at natural history, nature, conservation, science, and understanding that these are not absolute structures or guidebooks. These are tools. These are tools that have been used throughout history. These are tools that we can see the sources of and the origins of, which doesn't make them less real. It doesn't make them less able to affect us in our day-to-day lives. But what it does say is that they can be deconstructed if they enforce toxic ideology and toxic mannerisms. So I would say that decolonization is not a stage-by-stage process. It is a process that includes divesting, but it includes the building or constructing of alternative systems. Community is one of the largest parts of that. Community is an alternative system for understanding and growing and thriving. Now, when we're talking about conservation practice, again, we are talking about a subject that is there to conserve. Now, in my mind, and from what I've read, conservation and to conserve includes nurturing. It includes the ability to allow something to grow. When you allow something to grow, when you nurture something, you must do it in a multidisciplinary way, as I have seen. If you do it in a linear way, you end up curating it to a particular person or system or structure. So therefore, approaching it from multiple perspectives, approaching it from ways that we have not previously thought, again, within the systems that we are in, would work. These are all alternative methods and ways of producing systems that can create more thrival and more nurturing within especially natural and nature-based spaces. Facilitation. Facilitation is so essential to nurturing that discussion and that creativity. These are all lessons that you can learn from Indigenous writings and Indigenous teachings on the subjects of conservation, but also on the subjects of community building in general and the processes of decolonization. This building of alternative systems as we divest from others is this movement away from linear hierarchy, from absolute ideas of doing something, and more into the idea that there is a more fluid sense of understanding the natural world. There is a more fluid sense of understanding education, of understanding writing, and especially of understanding conservation and discussion. And facilitation, as one of the things that I do, is something that stems from the comfort that peoples and communities feel in particular environments and areas. And this cannot happen when occupation and exploitation occurs, because the comfort of a particular person or organizations or groups of peoples within particular environments relies on the understanding that there is emotional bias involved, that there is a connection to the natural world involved in those particular discussions. It cannot be a systematic or broken conversation where we talk about particular things in particular bubbles. It must have an intersectional approach, and it must bridge the gaps between these topics and between these subjects. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do with queer ecology. Queer ecology is this idea that you can divest and build an alternative system, and the alternative system, one of the tools of that alternative system anyway, is queer theory and queer ecology, because it refers to different ways of understanding subjects. And one of the things that I look at, a particular example of queering ecology, is deconstructing Darwinism, which again is a very foundational biological concept that is then put into a lot of conservation practice, that has been shown over the years to have been influenced a lot by the patriarchal and Eurocentric vision and ideology of Darwin in the ways that he grew up, and therefore has had actually a limiting factor on biology and the ways that it's manifested itself in biology, and therefore has limited the ways that we look at conservation practice. So again, fresh perspectives and consultation, importantly, because again, what we are doing is trying to look at the peoples and communities who have the best ways of divesting and building alternative structures and solutions. And these tend to be Indigenous communities and peoples who understand or have understood the landscape and nature in a way that is so different from colonial communities and colonial, especially Western colonial understandings of conservation.
I'm just mindful of the time, Jasmine, if you can finish in a few minutes.
I will try. Again, I feel like I got ahead of myself because it's such a big topic. So I'll quickly go through alternative futures. I've kind of talked about this already. We talked about decolonization, some of the methods of decolonization, the way that coloniality or colonialism is conceptualized within the system we're in. You must invest, I think, alongside divestment. And investment means alternative support. It means community knowledge. It means accessibility, understanding different aspects of conservation and nature management and natural history. When I'm talking about natural history in a conservation element, and when I'm talking to organizations about it, I will often reference poetry. I will often reference creativity and art as being a fundamental part of science. But I will also talk about discussion and talking to grassroots organizations and people who live within these particular communities. These are all different alternative ways of understanding a subject that has been taught to us in a very particular, very absolute way. When I'm talking about intertwined coexistence and conservation of people and nature, again, I'm talking about this idea that in order to conserve a particular species, we cannot just be looking at that particular species and saying, this is a green issue. This is an issue of nature and nature only, when we're not referencing humans and humanity as being part of nature. Because what we're doing then is, again, we are linearizing it. We are causing this conservation practice to be limited by the assumptions we have of that practice. And when I'm talking about queer ecology, again, I'm talking about questioning. I'm talking about the ability to question. I would hope that everyone at the end of this has the ability to question conservation practice as being an absolute. Again, working with organizations like RSPB England, the Wildlife Trusts, and other NGOs, we found again and again that the conservation practices that we are using are often limited. They don't work a lot of the time. And the reason they don't work is because they're based in corporate ways of thinking. They're based in economic ways of thinking. They're based in ways that are curated to that privileged elite subsection of society. And therefore, they are not the saviors of the environment, but they are aspects of colonialism that have been told to us are saviorisms of particular environments. Just mindful of the time. This last slide is mainly just some examples. These are some examples of how decolonial conservation is occurring now. There is hope. We are seeing more and more that we are divesting from certain systems. We are seeing more and more that decolonization is becoming a part of the daily lives of people. Again, if we're looking at things like the Palestinian conflict, if we're looking at, the Palestinian genocide, if we're looking at aspects of the world that are entrenched in colonial thinking, we are divesting, we are producing alternative systems, and therefore we are relying on more community-led and Indigenous-led ways of thinking. If we're talking about, for example, Indigenous-led, which is an organization or a collective that I think people should check out, and the reintroduction of buffalo and how that has roots in the communities that are reintroducing the buffalo, who live alongside the buffalo and who understand the rest of the landscape based off of those interactions. Again, we look at animals like caribou. We look at Brazilian indigenous tribes and the protection of the Amazon rainforest. We look at waterways and how they are connected to cities and how they are connected to people and societies. And so the conservation of those waterways needs to be connected to clean drinking water. It needs to be connected to the societies and people who live alongside them. Monga Bay is a really cool site where you can read up about particular Indigenous practices and conservation practices that are connected to that. And I think as a kind of as a kind of final point for this, storytelling, nature writing, and queer-centered pathways are ways that I have personally seen to be very enlightening in terms of how we can realistically decolonize structures and systems. And they are ways that I have seen, and people that I've seen within them, who talk about subjects, who understand subjects in a particular way, and who allow us pathways to more hopeful futures where we can conserve nature better and where we can conserve people better. This is a little thank you. And I was told to find a quote by someone else, but I couldn't find one where I felt like I would be able to explain it properly. So that's just me, a quote from myself, which again, just talks about the fact that this isn't really over. And after this presentation and the next presentation, which is also talking about a very core part of protecting and providing alternative futures to wildlife and nature, that you go and read up more and understand that even if you don't understand all of it or know all of it, there is hope within the fact that you've questioned it and broken apart these foundational things. And if you want to read more about my work or find out about queer ecology or, again, decolonial practices or decolonizing science or conservation, I'm at the moment working on a resource with the Naturalist Museum and Zoological Society of London, hopefully to make decolonization of conservation a better and bigger and more accessible subject. And I'm available for DMing if any of the words in this didn't make any sense or if I was speaking too fast. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you a lot, Jasmine. You can post and write question in chat. We'll go through them after Helena's presentation. Okay.
Can you see my presentation?
Not yet.
That's
yes.
Not a good start.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. I'll start then. Okay, so I'm Elena and I work for Wildcard, which is a grassroots rewilding campaign group. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about us later, but first of all, we'll take a look at what the problems we face are and how rewilding can provide a solution. So first of all, the problem. We are in the middle of the 6th extinction event on this planet, and the rate of species decline is more than 1,000 times faster than any of the previous mass extinction events, and that includes the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. So we're losing species more than 1,000 times faster than we lost the dinosaurs. And this is due to human pressures, including industry, agriculture, water, and energy usage. Now, industrialized agriculture is really a big driver of a lot of biodiversity loss. The intensification of arable, dairy, and livestock farming has caused unbelievable amounts of damage, ripping up habitats and using synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides. The government, the UK government, has stated that we're 30 to 40 years away from the complete eradication of soil fertility. Livestock farming has been shown to cause air pollution between 25 and 38% of what is found in cities. And the chair of the Environment Agency, just this February, has said that dairy farms account for 75% of all serious pollution incidents from agriculture, and that agriculture is the single largest source of pollution of our rivers, which actually beats sewage from water companies. Now, with agriculture and rewilding, there's often a rewilding versus food production narrative. But the truth is that agriculture depends on a healthy ecosystem, and we could actually take the least productive 20% of land that's used for livestock farming out of production and give it to nature, and we would only see a 3% reduction in calories. So we also are suffering through the climate crisis. In this country, we've had 110,000 hectares, which is an area 10 times the size of Greater Manchester, burned in wildfires since 2013. 55,000 people have been displaced due to storms and flooding between 2012 and 2022. Climate change is real, it's here, and we are suffering with it now, and so is everything else. The sea temperatures have broken records daily for over a year now. Plants, insects, and birds are mismatched in their timing so that food isn't available when needed, which is contributing towards the catastrophic declines that we're seeing. So we've lost 50% of our hedgerows in the past 75 years, which is a really important habitat that mimics scrubland, understory, and the creeping woodland edge that is missing from our landscapes now. We've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows since the 1930s. 41% of our insects face extinction, and the numbers of flying insects have declined by 60% in just the past 20 years. We've also lost 73 million wild birds since 1970. So clearly things are going very, very badly in terms of our biodiversity and bioabundance. So we need to rewild, and that leads us on to our solution. But let's have a look at what rewilding is, because rewilding is a word that is thrown around quite a lot, and it can mean different things to different people. So rewilding is process-led rather than goal-led, unlike traditional conservation techniques. So whereas normally in conservation we have a fixed idea of what habitat and what kind of species we want to see in this area and manage it often very intensively for that, rewilding instead, we kickstart natural processes again and just see what happens, and it often leads to really surprising results. One of the key concepts of rewilding is known as the 3 Cs, which is cause, corridors, and carnivores. So cause refers to core areas that are rewilded, where natural processes are in place and doing their thing. Corridors relates to connectivity between those cores so that animals and species can move around the landscape, ensuring that there is genetic resilience in populations. And carnivores create what is known as a trophic cascade. So essentially, they create a landscape of fear for grazing herbivores, ensuring that areas are not overgrazed by different animals, which is something that we are missing in the UK. So there is a spectrum of rewilding. The smaller the area of land, the more human intervention may be needed on an ongoing basis. After we've kickstarted those natural processes, we still might need to manage it. So the UK is really cut up between roads and urbanisation, and because of that, we may have to look at a range of different scales. Ideally, we would have some areas like the Yellowstone and Oostvaardeplassen, where we have larger areas that are minimum management intensity, but probably with a lot around the Nep and Ennerdale, and still keeping in those traditional conservation areas, which have been vital in keeping some habitats and some species available that could then spread back out into the landscape as we rewild. So what are the kind of interventions that we need to kickstart our natural processes. So this is the big one, species reintroductions. This is the headline grabbing side of rewilding. If you've read about rewilding in the news, it's likely that you've read about species reintroductions, such as beavers, which are excellent wetland ecosystem engineers, bison, which restore much needed wild grazing herbivore disturbance. We have boar, whose rootling creates dynamism in the ecosystem. Pine martens, who experts are hoping will control the grey squirrel population enough to see the return of red squirrels. And recently, we've seen a boost to the wild population of wildcats in Scotland, which has been somewhat controversial. And on to even more controversial, but desperately needed apex predators such as lynx, wolves, and maybe one day even bears. However, I don't have much hope at the moment that that's going to happen in my lifetime. Species reintroductions are often a controversial subject, often seen in terms of conflict that Jasmine was talking about, the human versus nature. We have our world and we don't want nature to impinge on it, but we need to shift into an idea of coexistence and a willingness to be inconvenienced at times that people in this country haven't had to deal with for centuries. So another way of kickstarting our natural processes is to restore habitats that have been intensively managed and redesigned by humans. So we can look at rewiggling rivers, which restores natural floodplains, allows dynamism back into the river system, and also has the effect of reducing flooding downstream. We have wood pasture, which at one point would have covered most of the British Isles. And it's an ecosystem it's really interesting because vegetation is always trying to reach close to cover woodland. But on the other side of that, we have large herds, or we should have large herds of grazing herbivores. So in that constant push and pull, we find this open wood pasture landscape. We have peat restoration, which is immensely important. Peat at the moment stores 3.2 billion tonnes of carbon just in the UK, which it releases as it dries out, and it dries out because of what humans have done to it. It's incredibly biodiverse, and it could create a huge amount of resilience in our landscapes in face of the climate crisis by slowing the flow, essentially keeping water in the landscape, reducing both flooding and drought. We also have scrubland, which is also another wonderfully biodiverse habitat and something that has disappeared due to British ETD, ecological tidiness disorder. We have this intense desire to tidy up and manage anything that looks messy, but it is the messy and chaotic bits of nature that provide the best food sources and the best habitats for a huge range of plants, insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals. So we also have seagrass meadows, which can contribute up to 20% of marine carbon sequestration, but are badly affected by sewage pollution. It's a habitat that had almost disappeared from our shores, and the same with kelp forests. Once abundant, they have now dwindled, but there are efforts being made now to restore them. And we also have soil, not often talked about in terms of rewilding, but if our soil is in a poor state, then everything going up the food chain will be affected and natural processes won't be able to take hold, or at least not in the time scale that we need them to. So, necrobiome. The necrobiome is death and decay in our landscape. It's another victim of our ecological tidiness disorder and health and safety. The death of animals in the landscape that stay out there feed a whole world of bacteria, fungi, and insects, which then take it down into the soil, taking down those nutrients, replenishing minerals, and feeding all of the life that stretches meters and meters down into the soil, making it very resilient and capable of dealing with extreme weather, which also means that the plants and the animals that rely on those plants can deal with these extreme weather events too. The mycelial network is a huge part of this. Mycelium essentially allows plants to access the nutrients in the soil. And without this network, our food systems and all of nature would collapse pretty quickly. So in light of all this, why isn't this happening on a large scale in the UK? Because of land inequality. In England and Scotland, less than 1% of the population owns over 50% of the land. And of the big landowners, we have a lot of publicly accountable landowners. And the big four you see here own over 1.5 million acres that they could be using to ensure that all of life, including humans, has a future. And we want rewilding. We're overwhelmingly in favour of it, but clearly there needs to be a change in the way that we do things. And that's where Wildcard comes in. I did say I was going to get back to us. We want to see 50% of the land rewilded, somewhere on that rewilding scale, which can include farms that still produce food and even looking at rewilding cities. We want people to be able to access that land, to feel connected to it, and so that they can take care of it. What you can't see, you can't love, you can't know what's going on with it. So we have an opportunity here to be leaders in these crises that we are facing all around the world, as a nation who sees the problem, sees the solution, and actually decides to implement the solution. So we've had some success so far. We had a very successful campaign against the Crown Estate, who, because of what we did, triggered a land usage revision of their estate. They've now introduced beavers and are even rewilding some of Balmoral. We've gained a lot of media attention over the past few years, really trying to draw attention and expand the conversation around rewilding, around what is possible, and drawing attention to the fact that if we're going to do this, it needs to be the people who currently own the land that decide to do it. We've held community talks, mobilised people for marches, as well as having our high-level talks with landowners, NGOs and MPs. And later this year, we will be looking at rewilding the church and common land, which is unfortunately far too archaic and convoluted to get into any detail here, but has amazing potential to reimagine how we think about land ownership and who has rights for it and what that means for nature. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of rewilding in action here in the UK. First, we have the Knepp Estate, the flagship rewilding estate in the country. So the owners, Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell, used to be intensive dairy farmers, but switched to rewilding in 2001. It's now a breeding hotspot for critically endangered nightingales and turtle doves. They also have the largest population of purple emperor butterflies in the country. They've got all 5 resident species of owl and 13 out of 17 species of breeding bats. We have Wild Ken Hill in Norfolk. So they've divided into 3 main approaches: a rewilding area where they have beavers and grazers, a traditional conservation approach for the coastal areas, and regenerative farming to continue to provide food in a sustainable and biodiverse way. So they have had a colony of bee wolf, great green bush crickets, and wasp spiders arrive. They've also seen the first caterpillar of the spurge hawk moth, The first time it's been seen in Norfolk since 1952. Dundragon is an incredible project up in Scotland, bought by a charity, Trees for Life, in 2008 to restore the Caledonian forest. They have planted over 255,000 trees, and the vegetation is changing, becoming thicker and lusher. And one really positive indication for them is that the black grouse population has increased by 50% at Dundragon. And then Langholm is a particularly interesting case, which is a community buyout. So the town of Langholm decided to buy out 4,000 hectares of a degraded grouse moor estate that was on its doorstep. And this has led to a new conservation area called the Tarras Valley Nature Reserve. They've had hen harrier chicks fledging and curlew, black grouse, short-eared owls and golden eagles, as well as many other types of birds and animals returning to the once very severely degraded land. So I'm going to finish very quickly on what's coming. There are two big things at the moment for rewilding in the UK, which is biodiversity net gain and environment land management scheme. So biodiversity net gain is a new system brought in, which is kind of similar to carbon offsetting. Essentially, any kind of development which may affect a habitat needs to prove now that biodiversity improves by 10% because of the project. Now that is on the site where it's happening, if possible, but if not, they are allowed to buy biodiversity net gain credits to offset the biodiversity loss. So for example, if a housing development cannot improve biodiversity on its site, it can just buy credits at a rewilding project to offset what has been lost. Now, a part of the problem with this is that obviously offsetting is not really ideal. All we're doing is taking biodiversity away from one area and putting it somewhere else. It does mean rewilding projects will have an income stream, which is really positive. However, it also means that the cheapest and most degraded land is now going to shoot up in price and be out of reach of the less affluent people, because it's now an investment. Obviously, more rewilding is good, but doing it in a way that pushes people out, that pushes less affluent people out, is not a sustainable way. And if we're still trying to put a price on nature, at some point in the future when it doesn't pay anymore, we can very well just plow over it or rip it out or cover it in herbicides. Asking the same system that has caused this problem to fix it is probably not the right way to do it. And lastly, ELMS, the Environment Land Management Scheme. So the government has actually done a pretty good job in changing farm subsidies, so that farmers are now encouraged to farm for nature. However, there have been some problems getting this going. They haven't made a hard commitment on how long they're going to fund this for, which has made it very difficult for farming communities to switch over. And the change from the basic farm subsidy, which people received before, which was just a lump sum for doing nothing. Obviously, there are a lot of farmers who do not want to go to all the effort to evidence that they are, in fact, doing things positively for nature. There are a lot that are, and that are really behind this. However, we have seen the farmers' protests across Europe and in Wales as a result of some of these changes in laws. So this has been a super quick whistle-stop tour of rewilding. It's introduced a lot of concepts and a lot of information in a very short time. So if you'd like to find out more about any of this, you can email at info@wildcard.land, and I'll be happy to share some more information with you, recommend some podcasts and some books. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take some questions now. And if you want to see more project that Rewilding, we'll have a walk in London next week for those who are interested, with some NGO who are doing Rewilding project in London in cities. We'll share the link afterwards in the chat. So we have a few questions. The first one from Zara. Sarah, I hope I'm not butchering your name. As a POC, how can I approach / discuss decolonization with people in my community who have internally become subservient to Western societies and believe the West is superior? Perhaps for Jasmine?
Yeah, this is a really, it's actually quite a tough problem, because again, what we've seen, and like I said before, one of the core aspects of decolonization is to destabilize the fact or thought process around the fact that this is a thriving landscape or thriving community beforehand, which makes it easier to introduce better or quote unquote better or savior techniques or practices or ways of thinking to said societies. And it happens through the destabilization of infrastructure of global communities around the planet, which means that, again, we now live in a, let's say, quote unquote, more liberated society in some aspects, which looks better on the kind of surface than other infrastructures or societies or communities around the world, because of that destabilization that's occurred and that continued destabilization. And I would say that's the best way to, whenever I'm talking, to explain it to communities. So if I'm talking to my own communities, so my Muslim communities or communities of Desi people who do believe that the British Empire is like the best thing to happen to the world, and to especially to areas of South Asia. The metaphor I use is kind of an abstract one, but it does tend to work. So one of the big kind of inviting, or one of the ways that the British Empire is seen as better, or Western colonial systems are seen as better, is through education. It's seen as having a more prominent, better education system. And the way that it has done this is, in the way that I explain it to various people, is by flattening the area around this particular environment. So let's say this hillock is the British Empire or a particular Western colonialist society, and it flattens the environment around it and makes a hillock in the middle, and then suggests that because we are standing above everyone else, that this is a better place to be than these other environments. And that kind of opens up the conversation, because what it allows people to understand is that actually it's not that this is an inherently better society, it's that it looks better because of the destruction of infrastructure that has occurred around the world. And there are many ways, there are many books, there are many films, if that's a way of ingesting education that people prefer. There are many podcasts that talk about the infrastructure destabilization that has occurred around the world. And once you plant that seed or understanding of the fact that actually, again, we are in a society where we are still oppressed, but we are not as oppressed as in certain ways that we can see on the surface than other societies, because of the infrastructure destabilization that's occurred in those societies, then you start to understand that not only is this just a better society because of the continued limitation of those societies, but also that we don't have a ton of stuff in this current society. We could be asking for a lot more. There are a lot more services that could be provided. There is a lot more stabilization that could be provided. In terms of nature, especially, there's a lot more that could be provided. There's a lot more that could be done to help, and there's a lot more that could thrive. So it's giving people this confidence to ask for more, which comes through the centering of, and when you're a person of color or global majority person, the centering of joy and the understanding that it's not a luxury for you as a person of color or global majority person to feel that. It is something that you should have. It is a right that you should have, and therefore to build upon that joy and to ask for more is not a bad thing. And once you understand that you can ask for more, then you start to understand that you don't actually have a lot, or that you are still limited in the system that you're in, and you don't need to be grateful for the small amount that you are given in the current society you are in, just because the society back home or the society that your parents come from has been so limited by colonialist structure or strategy that it no longer provides even the base rights or things for people to live and exist. And that, again, that shifts responsibility away from yourself for not being grateful, and it also allows you to question or ask for more. And then you can provide more of a discussion and more resources on that afterwards. That's a kind of short way of answering that. There are a lot more ways of talking about it, but if you want to discuss it, I'm open to that as well, because there's a lot of facilitated discussions that we need to have in Black and brown communities about, you know, mental health, the ability to ask for more, and the understanding that we are in an oppressed system, just in less ways that are more obvious because of the system we exist in.
I'm gonna try to combine a few questions because I'm mindful
Sorry.
of the time, and we are no worries. It's always really interesting. So first, we have questions about offsets and the approaches of biodiversity offsets, even plastic offsets. How do you grasp this idea of putting a price on nature with these offsets, or also with rewilding? Price has to be set, but how do you deal with this? So it's a question for both of you.
Yeah, so offsetting is really it's a very troubling concept, the idea that you can do damage somewhere and offset it somewhere else. Originally, carbon offsetting, carbon credits, was not supposed to be offsetting. It was supposed to be a tax levied on carbon emitters that the money was then would be used to put into projects to move us away from emitting carbon. If it was a system more like that, if we had a biodiversity tax where people that damage biodiversity, because housing developments are going to happen and stuff, we can't stop that at the moment, but actually we then used it specifically to work towards a society and a way of living that stops damaging, then that's one thing. But this idea, because where does the offsetting end? Are we just going to end up with like 75% of the world being in a hideous condition and then 25% being really nice? I mean, even that's quite an optimistic view, really, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because we are so entrenched in this capitalist system. And, I have recommended to people that are engaging in rewilding projects to sell biodiversity net gain credits, because it's an income stream. It's a way that they're going to be able to do it. A lot of people are not rich who are doing this. They manage to scrape together enough to buy a little bit and they want to do their bit, and so it's a way to get some money. But I think it needs to be well, we're going to take your money while you've got it, but we also need to be fighting this whole concept of capitalism as the answer to capitalism. It's not ever going to fix what it's done. It's the whole mindset, the whole structure, everything that Jasmine has been talking about. All of that needs to be broken down, and we need to completely rethink the way that we relate to life and the world and everything around us. Even the word nature is othering and puts us separate to it. There's so much work to be done. That, yes, I think offsets is like, it's like a band-aid on a raw gaping wound. Basically, it's better than nothing, but it's not the answer.
Jasmine, do you want to answer on that, or we have another question before Nicola's presentation?
Oh, we can move to the next question. Yeah, I think that was adequately answered.
Yeah, we can take a last question before Nicola presents a few action of King's encompasses. It's I have a few questions on science, because so the first one is more on the Darwinism, but globally, because we know that science is today largely concentrated in Western research done by Western people through their lens. And how do we approach that information gap is the question about using science, but perhaps sort of I can't say that, but using all this approach of conservation policy also in science, or how do you do that right now?
I think so I read the comment on the Darwinism one, and yeah, I think the way to do this is to focus a lot on unlearning and unpicking a lot of the toxicity that exists within science and especially biology. I think, again, this idea that we need to break down a particular subject and then erase those particular parts is not useful. You have toxic structures within biology and ecology. For example, certain methods and ways of looking at evolutionary biology. These are things that are tinged with, a lot of patriarchal toxicity, a lot of heteronormativity, which in this case is just used for me to talk about the stereotype that is suggested for heterosexual peoples, which again has become the dominant idea of many peoples within Eurocentric societies. These do exist within evolutionary biology. However, evolutionary biology is very large as a topic, and biology is very large as a topic, and there are aspects of these and practices that we can use we can still use these to unlearn and dissect science and nature in general. For example, at the moment, I'm approaching the idea of talking about queer ecology and talking about queer theory in ecology via the usage of the conservation of insects and using an insect or a pollinator in particular as a model species. And what I mean is I'm looking at this model species, I'm looking at the ways we can conserve it through a very up-to-date, perhaps scientific method, or what's the word? I've forgotten the word, but used a lot. A conservation tactic that's used a lot, or a way of studying this insect that's used majoritively. If I look at it through that, then I'm still using those practices and that understanding, and I'm still using that part of ecology. Even though I've broken it down to the point where I don't believe that that's a sustainable or useful way of looking at it, I'm still using it. And then at the same time, I am starting to try and build an alternative way of looking at it through aspects of sociology, for example, through talking to, again, Indigenous community, through talking to communities of people who approach natural history and conservation in a different way. And if I'm using both of those, and I'm more understanding of the fact that we need to divest and we need to build an alternative system of biology or conservation practice, then I can still divest, again, at the same time as building that alternative system and looking at the old parts and seeing which ones could be the parts that are foundational. Because you break everything apart and it's kind of hard to build things, especially in this system at the moment, which does oppress people to the point that there is not enough energy within communities and within people to build things from scratch. There is a necessity realistically to build things from the parts that we have already. And I think within evolutionary biology, there's a lot that can still be used. I would go into it more specifically, but I don't think we have a lot of time. But yeah, evolutionary biology is, like that commenter said, has moved on considerably since Darwinism. There is a lot that's in it that's still quite bad in terms of, and again, that's quite an absolute word, so maybe not useful, but it's quite toxic in terms of it's puts a lot of assumptions on a lot of things that are not questioned. And I would say, again, another way of doing it is introducing this idea of bias and partiality into science and nature. You cannot really be impartial. You can be different levels of less partial, to the point that you're covering up your partiality, almost to the point that you don't observe it yourself. However, to be impartial is to have no lived experience that leaks into it, to have no emotional connection to any of it, to have no connection at all to anything, which is kind of impossible, I think. in the ways that we do it. And why should it be possible? Why should we be doing things in that way? For the reasons that I've just talked about in terms of splitting nature and people apart, and that Elaine has also talked about. So yeah, that's kind of a roundabout answer, and there's definitely more on that to be discussed.
I think we had to run it up here for you. You both, thank you so much, Helena and Jasmine. To finish the session, we'll let Nicolas share some action at King's College on campuses, a bit shorter presentation, and then we'll finish off in a few minutes.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Yes, good. I'll just go ahead and share my slides then. And it should be that. Great. Okay. So hi everyone. So my name is Nicola Hogan, and I am the sustainability manager here at King's College in London, and it's my job to run the campus as sustainably as I can. Biodiversity and embedding biodiversity and nature in our campus operations is something that is central to what I do. And it is so central that it has its own section. It was identified as a key impact area within the Climate and Sustainability Action Plan this year. And even in the last year, it has added 2 more iterations to it. So that's really helpful. Helps us get focused and say, right, these are the actions that we need to take. And I'm all about actions. In terms of gardens and where we have them across the estate, I often get asked this, and there's a lot more than people kind of take for granted, or if you don't walk past a particular area, or if you have a tried and tested route going from your train station or your bus stop to your office, chances are you're missing most of the gardens that are available at King's. But there are 5 at Guy's, 6 at Strand and Waterloo, and there are 4 at Denmark Hill. And there are more in place in smaller pockets, and we're planning more as time goes on. So the idea is to expand these numbers as time over the years. So the slide here is the Waste to Wildlife Garden that was installed last year in association with Team London Bridge and the team at NHS. Much credit to Keltbray for donating and delivering the rubble and plants, and to Cityscapes for their design and organisation of the installation. And the vegetation that we've chosen is specifically for an urban environment because it's drought resistant, which means it can thrive and grow and expand and flower and bloom in the most toughest conditions. Sticking with Guy's, at the front of the Science Gallery, we have the herb garden, and those logs you see are, of course, bug hotels. And the herbs that are grown on this garden are used in the dishes that are served in the Science Gallery cafeteria. And so Guy's campus last year had a series of colourful planters installed. You'll see in the plinth in the back of the first slide, there is a image of what this garden looked like when it won the silver medal at the Royal Chelsea Flower Show 2 years ago now. And during the summer, when the planters are in full bloom, it really looks very pretty and brings a certain life to the campus. But the area in the slide to your right is an area that we've cleared away for planting, specifically for pollinator flowers. And planting of that is about to commence next month. We also did a series of planting in the Strand campus. So once the new Strand quad and engineering area was all finally refurbished, it looks absolutely beautiful, we decided it needed a bit of life. So we rolled out a series of planters. I think there's about 30 in total, stretching across to the quad in Bush House. But you'll see, again, they have the planters are of the colour of the King's Red logo, Where the Lions Red. And we also have apples growing. So, I mean, the idea is that King's Food will then use this fruit in their dishes, or indeed students can have them if they want to grab a snack, and so on. Another area that wouldn't be as obvious to people who are maybe just flying through King's is the Coleman Terrace. So previously this area was quite dull. The plants were sort of fading. So we just reused this area, and by adding in a couple of strategic planters that captured the light and sort of supported the plants around it, it really came to life and it transformed the area into a much prettier and altogether nicer place to be, which of course supports staff and students' well-being. Same again for the River Cafe Terrace in the Macadam building. We installed a series of brand new planters all along the edges. And the planters are actually made from reclaimed railway sleepers. And they've got that lovely tinge of sort of burnt wood, so they really looked good against the brutalist nature of the macadam building. So if you ever find yourself in the building, make sure you pop into the River Cafe Terrace and take a look. And we've specifically chosen those plants, first of all, to attract pollinators, but also to just brighten up the space. Now, the image you see on your left-hand side is not King's Campus. It is of another Grade 2 listed building. I believe, I think it's the University of Reading. Don't quote me on that. But the point was, I thought it just looked absolutely fantastic. And this was something that was done by a team of enthusiastic volunteers. I'd love to see something similar if we could get it started in the King's, the Strand site as well, of course. And then we have the event space, which is the terrace at Ruth's Cafe, which is on the 8th floor of Bush House. And this is what it looks like at the moment. It's quite bare, and we have an olive tree right in the middle, and of course it's dying. But we do have plans in place to make sure we embed a bit of biodiversity here and really use the space. And the hope is that as people are sitting out and looking out into this fabulous city that we live in and work out of, they're also reminded of how green London used to be. And the plan is to put planters all along the edges to really brighten the space up as well, and hopefully give people a greater appreciation of biodiversity in an urban environment, because the two are not mutually exclusive. These images here are, of course, of the recently pedestrianised Strand. It really is just a fantastic space. I think the team have done an amazing job, and it's a wonderful place to sit and relax on a summer's evening. We are going to try and mirror that as much as we can, and emulate it in our spaces across the estate, because not just from a biodiversity value, but also just for purely aesthetic reasons as well. Couple of other spaces across the estate we're looking at. I mean, here is the front part of Maughan Library. So where we see a gap between the hedging, no reason why we can't fill in a few more hedges there. Here on the right-hand side, you see just a little area outside a smaller building that is just bare doing nothing. So my feeling is, if we're allowed, we install some planters, because of course it's a protected site. Or even bike racks. So that would all depend on planning permission from the authorities. Same again in the garden at the immediate front of the library. The vegetation could just do with a bit of thickening up here and there. Again, the side of the library, you have a cut down tree, ideal bug hotel, but let's put some signage in there as well, and maybe a small planter if we can. And finally, a team of really enthusiastic gardeners at Denmark Hill have taken over the space at the rear of the WEC, which is the Western Education Centre. And there's another seated area at the rear of IOPPN, and lots of other little pockets across the Denmark Hill estate where the team have just decided we're going to take ownership and we're going to plant this space. So the images in this slide are at the rear of IOPPN, just as you enter the Students' Union hub. But also the first little section there, the first image, is a grass roof that I think has just taken on incredibly well. And it was just a flat roof that was doing nothing, so why don't we plant it? Again, at the front of the James Black Centre, we asked Southwark Council if we could have some whips, and they sent us 200, which we happily planted. And then in front of the IOPPN, we installed a planter, which has been moved elsewhere now. But the concept of just saying this space is bare, it could do with a planter, is something that it's a message we're sending out to all campus managers and staff as well, academic staff and technical staff as well. Just let us know where you want to see a space greened, and if you're going to take ownership of it, that's even better. We'll give you the tools and the resources to help you get started. This is a list of all of the trees that we have planted across the King's Estate since November 2021. It's an awful lot. It's coming on well over 1,200 at this stage. And this is just what a day in the life of a tree planting group of enthusiastic volunteers is like. So this was New Malden in February, the first day of Sustainability Month. This is more of the volunteers. It is, I'm not going to say it's completely backbreaking work, but it's very energetic, and you do sleep well that night. And there's Nick O'Donnell in his blue shirt, our Director of Estates, giving us the helping hand that we need. but it's so simple. Most of the trees were given to us by the conservation volunteers. Everything comes in little whips and packs, and they're all labelled. And we literally just have to dig a hole, water it, add in a bit of compost, cover it up, and Bob's your uncle. And they provide the canes and the bamboo sticks as well. So those images are from earlier this year at Honor Oak Park, beginning of April, where we planted well over 175 or in around that tree, and we planted them in record time. The soil was just really going towards us, and the weather was definitely for us as well. The image you see here of the trees sprouting up at the other side of the fence from the street, and the little sapling busting through the cane protectors, plastic protectors, are trees we planted a little over a year ago. And so you can see that they are taking root. And that's in the space of maybe a year, 18 months. So within 3 years, you see a full bush. And then within 5 years, you'll see trees. And it doesn't just make the campus look good, it provides security as well to the estate. And again, there's just more images of the team planting volunteering sessions. So just to kind of reiterate what was mentioned from our previous two speakers, is that the global economy is 100% dependent on nature and natural resources. And I really wish the politicians and the economists and the corporate executives would realise that insects are on the decline, and as they are the pollinators, that directly impacts our food supply. 1 in 3 bites of food depends directly on pollinators. So without them, we're going to go hungry. And Kings are specifically choosing pollinator-friendly plants moving forward that will also survive in an urban environment, because we want to be quite strategic about that. This is what pollinators in the UK today look like. A lot of people think it's just butterflies and bees, but it's also moths. There's lots of different types of bees, and we have a whole other urban bee program starting soon at King's. So that much thanks to the University of Reading for putting those slides together and their speaker. And this is the bee hotel. So we are installing 30 of these units across the estate. So a mixture of urban bee hotels and urban bee observatory panels. Specifically designed to support urban bees, because urban bees are different from regular honeybees. In fact, anyone will tell you there is an imbalance across London, because about maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, having beehives became the trend and everyone had them, and now the swarms are just competing with one another. So we are delighted that the King's Estate really supports this, and it's an ideal location. So we're hanging those up over the next couple of months. And in terms of aspirations, all of the flat roofs that Kings have, we'd love to see this happen. We do have PV panels, and my plan is to put grassed areas or planters in between those areas, because nobody ever goes up there except the engineers to check on various meters and so on. So it's ideal, and it's a great way pollinators can just sort of buzz around and really get on with their job. And that is kind of it from me. Those are our aspirations for Kings. We encourage people to get involved as much as they can, and sign up to become a sustainability champion, or just, as and when, just get involved in sustainable events. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy that you also did really shortly, but it's really interesting. And if you want to know more about it, I encourage you to go on the nature walk next week. With Nicola will be there, and also the NGO Urban Bees, and Wilder with a walk around campus and in London streets. So that's all for today. We're a little over time, but it was really interesting. Thank you again for 3 amazing speakers, Jasmine, Elena, and Nicola.
You're welcome.
If you want to know more about this seminar series that we're going to continue next year, you can sign up for a newsletter, or also join our HEATS course if you are from King's, either student or staff. We'll share all the links in the chat, and feel free to contact us if you have any question. We'll try to share all the info Jasmine wants to share about the potential article and so on. So that's really all for today. Thanks again, and see you soon.
Thank you, Clarice.